Hello, everyone, and welcome to Airheart, A Tale of Broken Wings. This one took me a little while to get to, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, because I was recovering from kidney surgery, but two, because the game had a bit of an issue, and a really specific issue that only affected some people, and of course I happen to be one of them because of reasons, and the issue was that when you start up the game, it tells you that it's best experienced with a gamepad. Because it's actually a twin-stick shooter, and some of those are actually just fine with the keyboard and mouse, but in this case, absolutely not. This game's keyboard and mouse controls are terrible. They're really not good at all, and part of that's because for some reason it refused to accept my A key, so I couldn't turn left very well, because like 3 out of every 4 times it didn't actually register the fact that I was pressing left, so I had to like hammer it a bunch to actually turn left. But anyway, I was like, alright, well fine, I'll, plug in a gamepad and play it with that, because it, tells me that it's best to do that, so obviously I'll try that. And this is a game that is best experienced with a gamepad that wouldn't register a gamepad. It refused to actually recognize the fact that any were plugged in. I tried it with an Xbox One gamepad, a 360 controller, and even a Steam controller, and with like 4 different settings on it, and yeah, it just refused to acknowledge any of them. So there was just a bug happening, and the devs actually acknowledged this and eventually released a patch a couple of days ago that fixed the problem. And it did indeed fix the problem for me, and now I can actually play it because a gamepad will work, and I can actually play the game because, like I said, the keyboard and mouse controls are really not so good, especially when it refuses to acknowledge turning left. So now I can plug in a gamepad and actually play it. So here we go. That's why this video took a little bit of time to come out. So Airheart is ostensibly a twin-stick shooter with a pretty interesting aesthetic and world, and a pretty interesting mechanic in that it takes place in a world that is built in layers that are built upon each other. So as you can see in the background, you are in the sky, but you can see other sky layers below you. And those are actually previous levels that you have been to, which is really, really neat. And as you can see here, you actually go up and rise to other sky layers, and the one you just left behind is actually below you, and you do that repeatedly. And so the game takes place on a 2D plane when you're actually playing, but eventually you have to return to base, and when you do that, it actually becomes 3D, and you dive down through all of the previous levels that you just went through all the way back to base, which is a really, really neat idea, actually. You are actually a Dieselpunk Amelia Earhart, believe it or not, and you are a skyfisher, and the actual point of the game is to survive attacks on pilots and catch fish in the sky. And you process them into oil via some arcane, probably horrific process, and make money. So you're trying to go up, ascending higher and higher through the sky layers to get more and more valuable fish, and of course fighting more and more difficult pirates, and bring them down to your base to process into money to get better and more tough and powerful weapons and plane parts to customize your plane so you can make it even higher the next flight and get better fish and so on and so forth. It's a pretty neat Rogue-lite-esque balanced game that revolves around this concept of just, making more money every run and trying to get better parts every run to make even more money next run because you made it higher and farther. The sky layers seem to go in like 4 or 5 layer increments, and each of those will end in a boss fight, and the boss fights actually get pretty challenging. And you will then ascend to a different type of layer. So the first one is a forest of cherry blossoms. And here's actually the diving down, by the way. As you can see, you actually do have to dive through like a 3D field of all the previous layers, sky islands, and various things like that to get safely back to base. It's really pretty neat. And then the next layer up is an autumn forest, which is very pretty, actually. And then there is also like a snow area and things like that. They each get more and more difficult because they are more densely filled with more difficult enemies. And there's all sorts of things like big pirate like dirigibles and turrets and all sorts of other things around the place. And some of them have some really interesting ways of actually combating them, like just shooting them isn't always enough. They can have turrets along the way, and you actually have a harpoon on your plane. And it's interesting that the harpoon isn't actually just a weapon. It's a tool and a weapon, basically. You can use it to get very large fish that you can't actually just collect by running into them and actually drag them back down to your base with you. You can, of course, only do this one at a time. And you can also use it to rip off pieces of very large structures and enemies. So some structures will have things like armor plating that will block your shots from hitting them from that direction, so you can harpoon those plates and actually rip off the armor plates that way. You can find arms with big turrets on them and rip off the arms so they can no longer shoot you from that direction, things like that. And for smaller enemies, you can even do things like just harpoon the enemies and swing them around, which is actually a lot of fun, because I was being harassed by a really annoying laser drone at one point, so I just harpooned the drone and swung around in a circle and bashed it against some rocks, and it blew up. It's a lot of fun, actually. It's just kind of like a bit of a physics-based combat in the middle of the normal actual twin-stick shooting combat, and it's pretty cool. And there are lots and lots of plane parts that you can get your hands on, and you can mix and match them. You don't have to get an entire plane's worth of parts and only use those. You can actually get several different kinds of parts and just sort of mesh them together, you know, from whatever you have. And the 3 different categories impart different stats upon your plane, as well as an overall mass value that depends on how heavy it will be, and thus, like, you know, how much power your engine will have to give out to make it go particularly fast. And you'll also, one part will give it a specific passive ability, and one part will give it an active ability that you can use. So this particular, the engine gives it its active ability. This particular one has a boost that makes it just basically like a short dash of very high speed. And I've also got one particular useful passive ability that actually negates damage from contact. So like if you ram into something, it no longer damages you. Normally it does damage if you actually hit something. So if you're in like really narrow areas or areas with lots of fast enemies that like to smack into you, that's useful to have. And there are also loads and loads of weapons to get. And your wings actually determine how many weapons you can equip, either 1 or 2, so you can have either just a main weapon or a main weapon and a sub-weapon to switch between. And you can also, like I just did there, find little crates that alter your currently equipped weapon temporarily, like power-ups, essentially, like in an arcade game style of setting. Which is pretty sweet. And the weapons range from really, really cool to almost entirely useless for a variety of reasons, because either they don't do very much damage and have like an odd fire rate, or oddly enough the game has recoil. The weapons can actually push your plane physically around the sky, and some weapons would be really useful theoretically, like say the minigun, which is very powerful, but it has such an obscene amount of recoil that it pushes you around just like crazy, so it's actually not very useful at all. It's very weird that they decided to do this. I'm not sure why. It's actually kind of fine on some weapons, like there's this railgun style of weapon, for instance, that charges up and then fires an extremely fast, very powerful single shot, and it pushes you really far when you use it, which is kind of fine because that's, you know, sort of how a railgun works in general. But other weapons, like say the minigun, it just like shifts you around the sky at like a really high speed. And it's not actually all that useful as a result, because it's almost uncontrollable. So yeah, the recoil system is odd. Some guns have none whatsoever, and some have so much that they're almost impossible to control. And some guns are just not useful at all, and seem like they should be, because they're very expensive, which makes them seem very prodigious to acquire. But once you actually have them, you realize that they're not very good, like the flamethrower, for instance. Seems like it would be extremely good because it costs like 5 times as much as the next most expensive weapon in the shop, and it's by far the most expensive one you can buy. And yet it's actually not very good at all. So I'm not sure exactly what they were doing with the weapon system in this game, but it's really a bit of a trial and error kind of thing to figure out which ones are good and which ones are not, but most of them are at least interesting. There's like, you know, sniper cannons and instant hit lasers, this weird like frost caster thing that's pretty cool. There's all sorts of really interesting stuff even shotguns, and sky shotguns are pretty cool. The aesthetic of the game is also very interesting because it uses that sort of simple flat shading style for the environment and the overall aesthetic of the particles and things like that, like the fog that you're seeing, which makes it look very, very pretty from an environment standpoint. And it even has like a photo mode when you pause it. I think you can get some really good like desktops and things. It's very pretty. It reminds me of The Long Dark and Firewatch, games like that also use like that simple flat shading aesthetic for their environment art. And you combine that then with the like Dieselpunk aesthetic of the planes and the dirigibles and all the enemies and your own craft. And it makes for a really interesting looking game. And honestly, the actual planes and other enemies and things remind me a lot of Crimson Skies a little bit, actually, which is a pleasant game to be reminded of occasionally. And then, of course, you also factor in the fish and all the other various things floating around the sky, and it all comes together to be a very pretty and an interesting looking game in general. And then finally, the game also has a crafting system, and the crafting system is surprisingly in-depth. So the way that it works is, also, while you're gathering stuff in the sky, mostly from destroyed enemies and the like, you get these raw materials. Like machinery and glass and pipes and things like that, and you can combine these raw materials into other things. The other things are not actually useful, they are also things that you craft with. Works a bit like a sort of Minecraft mod, almost. And then you combine all these other things, the more advanced things that you've crafted, repeatedly into even more advanced things, and you keep doing this until eventually you can craft the continuously more advanced things into something that you can use. Like, for instance, in the background here, I'm crafting things like barrels and scopes and magazines and the like that I've made from ammunition and metal pieces and all sorts of other stuff into a weapon, which is finally something I can use. It's almost like a conveyor belt kind of system. And it's a really interesting way to do crafting, and it's actually very satisfying to figure out recipes that eventually lead to something usable for yourself. And you can craft pretty much all of the plane parts this way rather than buying them, and all of the weapons in the shop rather than buying them. However, the interesting thing about this is a lot of the weapons you can craft, like this thing, for instance, the long strike sniper cannon, are things that you actually cannot buy in the shop. They are only craftable. So a lot of the really, really good weapons and the like are things that you actually have to craft. And as an example, this particular weapon is really, really strong. It's very powerful. It's got some odd recoil to it, but you can actually get used to it because of its low fire rate, so it does not actually make it useless. It's very strong. And this makes the crafting system worthwhile to delve into, even though it's a bit confusing at first and a little bit overwhelming with the number of things that you can make that don't actually do anything for you at first. It's just a process of repeatedly putting things together into higher tier things, and then putting those higher tier things together into even more higher tier things that eventually yield a useful result. And it just takes a little bit to get used to. Now, my time with Airheart has been interesting, because I have to say, I think it's a good game, but it's a good game that's kind of surrounded with a ball of frustration. And that's because it's balanced strangely. It is a game that has an odd balance to it, because I mentioned that it's sort of a rogue-lite game. And that's because what happens when you die is very strange. So if you lose all of your health, you careen back down to base. You the same thing happens when you decide to leave and go back down to base on purpose. But if you die, you lose all your health, you're sent back down to base forcefully and make a crash landing. And if you make a crash landing successfully, there's a chance that you can lose your plane parts, some of your plane parts. And these things can take hours worth of grinding up money to actually purchase. And you can lose all of them from one bad run. And that seems very harsh, to actually be able to lose that much progress in a couple of minutes of one single run when it takes hours to actually get enough money to buy that many things, or get enough materials to craft them. But that's actually not the worst thing. If you die and then don't make it back to base successfully, you hit an island, or you say you overshoot and miss your home base, you lose your save completely. All of your crafting progress, all of the plane parts you had equipped, and all the plane parts you had in storage, all of your money that you had saved up, and all of your resources, all of it is gone. You have to start a new game entirely from scratch. Which seems inherently like a flawed bit of balance to me, because the game is balanced for a rogue-lite style of progression, where, you know, everything takes a while to get because you're meant to do many, many runs up and down, and occasionally, you know, fall back down, and you might lose some stuff. But it's meant to be played in several hour spurts where you know, repeat this over and over to gain all of these parts that take a long time, because that's what a rogue-lite style of progression is. But then combining this penalty with a rogue-like style of penalty, i.e. permadeath, complete permadeath, where everything is lost when you die for good, seems like the balance is a bit off to me. You know, permadeath, roguelike style permadeath is not new to me whatsoever. I have been playing true roguelikes like that I found on random BBSs since I was a kid. But it seems like you have to balance your game around one style of death penalty or the other. Either you lose everything and have to start completely fresh, or there's a chance you can lose something and you sort of incrementally work your way up when you die and start from the beginning and, you know, kind of go back again, which is what this game does, because that's the way it's balanced. That's what it's balanced around. And it doesn't seem you can balance around both simultaneously, and I've never seen a game try that. And this game definitely doesn't seem to get it right, because it's not balanced around both at all. So yeah, it's odd to me that they do the permadeath thing. I don't really get it. I've never seen a game try that before, and I don't really think you should try that, because it definitely doesn't work here. Other than that, I do think it is a very good game, and we haven't had very many twin-stick shooters recently, and I think this is a good one that is trying to do some new things, some novel things, and for the most part, it does them well. But it is, I think, a bit frustrating due to the penalties not really matching up with the game balance, in my personal opinion. And other than that, though, I think it is worth a shot to actually take a look at. So the link is in the description below this video if you want to take a look at it for 15 bucks. And there you go. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.